I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome to RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CJME and 650 CKOM. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture. So great to have you here to talk about the week that was in Canadian ag. And we got a great show for you here today. Looking forward to it. It is Easter weekend, so hopefully you're having yourself a really, really great weekend with friends and family and be able to kick back a little bit as Mother Nature does not seem to want to relent. No, lots of snowy, brutal conditions for Western Canadian prairies and also, quite for that matter, parts of Eastern Canada as well. So spring continues to be somewhat elusive for many of us. So today we're going to hear from Rene Roy. He is the chair of the Canadian Pork Council. He's been coming up here in a little bit. We're going to talk about how upset the Canadian pork industry is at the Canadian trade negotiators on the deal that they have apparently negotiated for the UK to join the CPTPP deal and what it will not mean for pork exports out of Canada into the UK. We're also going to hear some of the transportation issues that were in last week's federal budget. Greg Northey will be here from Pulse Canada to dig deep into those issues. And we'll finish up with a discussion with Dr. Tom Warketin. He is obviously the pulse breeding specialist. You know him very, very well at the University of Saskatchewan Crop Development Center. If you have any feedback on today's show, we would love to hear from you. My email is shaney@realagriculture.com, or you can follow Real Agriculture across all the different social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, or you are more than welcome to dial up the Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. Now, I mentioned how upset the Canadian Pork Council is at this whole CPTPP situation. And the UK, and remember, we had a trade deal with the UK through the CETA agreement, but the UK has left the EU. And so we need to have a new deal. And so the UK has great desire to enter the CPTPP, which that is very understandable. But the Canadian Pork Council, and quite frankly, as you heard on last week's show, the Canadian Cattle Association, not ecstatic about this. Let's listen to what Rene Roy, the chair of the Canadian Pork Council, had to say.
In the past, with the trade negotiation we have done, especially with Europe, we have agreed for opening our market in exchange of some of their market, but we now know that the rules are unequal. The European countries, including UK, in this in what we can see in the text right now, they are providing some non-tariff trade barriers, which blocks our entry to their market. So, in fact, even if there is some market access on paper, it's not allowed in practice because of non-tariff trade barriers.
Has there been any explanation why the Canadian trade negotiators, Canadian government would, I guess, go forward with the UK joining the CPTPP, knowing that it's impossible for Canadian pork to get into the UK based on their non-tariff trade barriers?
We are currently working with the government to have clarification on this point. It is clear that it is specific to our industry. So what one of our hypothesis is that it is so precise for our market, for our meat market, that they must be clearly aware of what is happening, what has happened in the past, and making sure that the text brings us to a different point. And it may not be easy to see. They are, for example, they are saying that the UK is saying that we are using a growth hormone. We shouldn't use growth hormones for when we grow pig. Which is not true. We are not using growth hormone in our Canadian pork. it's an example where they are misleading not only the country and the negotiators, but they are also misleading other trade partners and the citizens about how we grow pork. We have our one of the best production in the world, and we have also an inspection system that can defy any other one in the world. So I am confident that it's just a matter of adjusting our text, and if they don't want pork to be included in their market, they must be upfront and say so, but shouldn't play by little rules on the side and blocking our market after we have agreements.
Outside of the UK issue, has Canadian Pork Council been happy with the CPTPP deal so far?
Yes, CPTPP has been a good one for us. Of course, with the COVID and the problem of logistics has been tougher, but it was not because of the trade agreement. So I would say that this one was a good one, but UK right now tried to copy what has been done in European Union. So we are not in favor of this kind of trade agreement.
How big of an opportunity, if these non-tariff trade barriers were removed, how big of an opportunity is the UK market for Canadian pork exports?
There is, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but because their trade balance is negative, there is a good potential for our industry to meet the demand in the UK. That's more a matter of having a market access that is reliable, and we could propose good products there. With a trade barrier, with a trade balance that is negative, it's clear that we could be competitive in their market, and that may be one reason why they do that.
Yeah. So now what? What are the next steps, Rene? What do you feel needs to happen next in order for this to be rectified and for Canadian Pork Council to be satisfied with the UK and their membership into the CPTPP?
What we are doing right now, we are working closely with the government, not only with CFIA, but also with the trade minister, so that we are able to find solutions, the negotiators, and we are in close link also with Minister Bibeau, who has helped a lot in this process to find solutions to the struggle we have right now with the text.
Something else to keep on your radar when it comes to the UK joining the CPTPP potentially is there is market access for dairy products through the CPTPP, and there was compensation paid out to dairy farmers across Canada for that market access. Now, New Zealand has been challenging Canada and their allocation of TRQ, similar to what the U.S. is doing under that USMCA deal. The UK potentially could try to fill some of this quota. And that's something that probably we're going to hear a little bit more about. And I think we may also hear some countries say, Canada, this is super rich. You're saying the UK is using non-tariff trade barriers to get proteins into the country. What are you doing on dairy? Because there's numerous countries, as I just alluded to, saying Canada's doing the same thing. So this seems to be kind of the trade arena right now is lots of concerns about non-tariff trade barriers. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more of RealAg on the weekend here on 980 CJME and 650 CKOM.
Hi, I'm Lyndsey Smith of RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern for The Agronomists, Canada's only live, interactive, agronomy-based show. Each week, we answer your most pressing questions with a rotating panel of agronomists, researchers, and extension staff from across Canada. Join me Monday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, or head to realagriculture.com/live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Hey, I'm Kelvin Hepner, and I just wanted to give you a heads up about a new project that we are working on here at RealAgriculture together with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI. We're calling it the Ag Policy Connection. Stay tuned. The first episodes of the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. They'll be showing up here on RealAgriculture and in your podcast feed on your podcast player shortly.
And welcome back to RealAg on the weekend. I had a chance this week to chat with Greg Northey. He is with Pulse Canada. And we talked about some of the transportation-related items in the federal budget that was disclosed last week.
Yeah, there was quite a few transportation items in there. And, budgets often, even if there aren't dollars assigned to it, they will hint at policy direction, which can be really positive for us. And so there's a few items in there that were very more policy, legislative focused around just indicating the way government wants to look or start to do things. And often with these budgets, that's one of the biggest impacts we can see.
I like that. They're pulsy. I like that. Okay, so we got $27.2 million over 5 years starting in 23-24 to Transport Canada to establish a transportation supply chain office which will work with the industry and other orders of government to respond to disruptions and better coordinate action to increase the capacity, efficiency, and reliability of Canada's transportation supply chain infrastructure. Is this, when I first read that, my first reaction, Greg, was, why weren't we doing this already? What's your take on it? What does this mean to you?
Yeah, so this came directly as a recommendation from the National Supply Chain Task Force that published their report last fall. One of the things that they felt would be important was this overarching supply chain office that would bring together different departments within the federal government, as well as ways with industry to address supply chain disruptions. And I think one of the real impetuses for it was when we had our issues at West with the track outages, and all kinds of different departments had to get involved with that and the response to that. And I think the idea is that if you have this one-stop shop, this one office to look at things, that you can maybe start to coordinate action better. Why haven't we had it before? Well, we have a regulator. We have the Canadian Transportation Agency, which is meant to deliver some of this already, when it comes to particularly the regulated, the railways, and particularly around delivering efficiency and reliability, through a regulated format. But they're never. And obviously we have the Department of Transport Canada, which in a way they have groups within the federal government already that look at this. But this conceptually would be new. Would be crossing the borders of different departments. Okay,
in having some this single entity though needs to have some sway, some swagger's not the right description, but some teeth to be able to try to prevent or enact change to try to fix situations. That's also an important, I would think, would be an important component of something like this.
Yeah, for sure. And it was one of the, when we saw that recommendation in the task force report, that was our initial focus, and that many of the things that we face as far as issues within the supply chain require teeth. They require a regulated backstop. They require, especially when you start to look at the railways, but even in other places. So, so do you need to replicate that? When you start to look at more policy-focused things and, just collaboration or, working or having dialogues with industry, maybe there's a role for this. So, it'll be interesting how it gets set up, what kind of people they put into it. But ultimately, when you really look at driving change, a lot of it will come still from say, the agency or Transport Canada particularly.
There also was talk here, Greg, as far as amendments to the Canada Transportation Act to provide Minister of Transport with the authority, and that probably is an important word here, the authority to compel data sharing by shippers accessing federally regulated transportation services. What does that exactly mean?
So essentially what it means is that they would legislate the ability to make a regulation in the Canada Transportation Act. So like we saw with Bill C-49 a few years ago, when they decided that they wanted to compel more data from the railways, the language in the act just said, okay, now you shall make a regulation, and then we went into a 5-year-long regulatory process. So basically what it means is they will signal that they want to regulate data from shippers, and compel it basically, because that's what regulations do. So that seems to be their intention on how they would compel through regulation.
Yeah. Now, is this good for farmers, or are there concerns here?
Yeah, there are concerns here. This is a big undertaking. One of the reasons why you can focus on, say, the railways or the ports or these bodies to get the kind of information you need to improve supply chains is because there's not many of them, right? And so you have 2 railways who handle the vast majority of the traffic. They have all the data of what's happening in the network. So that's where you go for your data. When you talk about shippers, and the reality is this isn't just shippers in the grain sector we're talking about. We're talking about shippers across the spectrum. So many, I dare say thousands of shippers who are shipping things in Canada daily. They're importing or exporting. And this idea that you would be compelling data from them. Now, obviously, they would have to compel that data. They would have to be using federally regulated transportation services, which are railways, which particularly for grain are elevators, terminals. So, the focus here on grain is much stronger, let's say, than as far as getting data from specific operations within the grain sector, because other sectors, their mills or whatever, aren't necessarily always going to be federally regulated. So this does have a particularly grain-centered focus. And so, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say red flags, but potentially red flags around this on what exactly would they be compelling, where is the actual value for it, how you would get it from from the grain sector specifically. When you look at the pulse sector, we have, close to 100 shippers of these products, pulse and special crops, who could be operating, shipping container here, container there. Are they just going to be targeting large shippers? Why would they just be targeting large shippers?
So Greg, who pushed for this?
Well, that's a great question. Similarly, this was something that was in the the task force report. So they did hint at something like this idea that increased collaboration could be driven from everyone providing their data to the system. I know that from a shipper group perspective, we certainly weren't pushing for this, because ultimately the performance of the system is driven by, the service provider as opposed to individual shippers. Individual shippers provide data now to their service provider. So there is no mystery around, if you're ordering transportation services from the truck or whatever, from the rail or whatever, you're clearly giving that market signal already. So, we don't necessarily see where the value is going to come from this. But I would say that the precedent has been set. There's a bill right now, C-33, which looks at the Marine Act, where they have very specific language where they would like to compel data from the users of the port, which means the shippers. And so we're seeing it in that act, we see it in this act. So there's clearly a plan here around compelling this kind of data, and it's not fully clear yet how it would be used and what direction this is going to take. So definitely interesting, but something that I think we're going to be watching really closely.
There was one more transportation item in the budget, and it had to do with interswitching, and I'm going to ask Greg about that when we come back after this quick break on RealAg on the Weekend, only on 980 CJME and 650 CKOM.
The next generation is the future of agriculture, but how do we launch from one role to leading? From succession planning and family dynamics to understanding finances and making the tough calls to discovering paths others have taken all through agriculture, the Successors Podcast covers it all. Tune in with me, your host, Kara Oosterhuis, simply by searching The Successors on your favorite podcast platform, or you can find it by visiting www.realagriculture.com.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
Here on RealAg on the Weekend, we're talking to Greg Northey of Pulse Canada, continuing our conversation all about the budget that was released by the federal government last week and looking a little bit deeper into some of those transportation issues. The commitment to introduce amendments to the Canada Transportation Act for a temporary extension on a pilot basis of the interswitching limit in the prairie provinces to strengthen rail competition. Is this something that Pulse Canada supports?
Yes, absolutely. This was something that Pulse Canada, as well as many in the grain industry, supported. This return to extended interswitching, and again, this was in the National Task Force report. So, interesting qualifications here. Temporary pilots, but we'll take it as opposed to not seeing it. In this was, like I said earlier, from a policy direction for a budget, this is quite strong, and that we'll see this happen. We expect there'll be consultations around distance, because it's quite silent on distance as far as what that interswitching distance should be, and also the focus on the prairie province is interesting, but it's good, and the fact they recognize that it strengthens rail competition is also good. So, from a policy signal standpoint, this one is quite good to see in the budget.
Overall, Greg, were you happy with the transportation issues that were addressed in the budget, or were there things that were left out that you feel were missed?
Well, there was one last one that I would say was particularly happy, for the Pulse sector, which was the Shipping Conferences Exemption Act. We're launching a review of that, and so that's for us and others in the grain sector, obviously, but we rely on containers quite a lot, and so this is the act that is really focused on how shipping lines function in a competitive basis and how they serve Canada. So this has been a huge driver for us for the past, 3 years probably, around what kind of systems do we need to put in place to bring a bit more competitive oversight to shipping lines. And so this was a big one for us as well. So I would say that with this included, along with the other things, especially with the interswitching, when you look at what you can expect from a budget and what it can direct government to do, this was a pretty good suite of things. Obviously, some things we're a bit hesitant about, but from at least an initial policy direction, just recognizing the lack of competition, as well as our focus on this year's around marine containers. It was quite good. We were very pleased to see this. It was positive, and clearly that task force report had an impact, and they were listening. At least from government perspective, they were listening to what our priorities were.
Is that transportation task force, is their work done, or is it ongoing?
No, they're done. Yeah, that report, once it got published, they were done. So it was really left in government's hands as to what they took and what they didn't take. And there was a lot of recommendations in that report. So, these three, the supply chain office, which, may or may not be effective, but certainly we're going to do everything we can to make it effective. And then the interswitching and the Shipping Conferences Exemption Act were all, those were some of the top priorities that we pulled from that report. So it was good. It's good to see.
Okay, great stuff. Hey, Greg, thanks so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it. All the best to you.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
That was Greg Northey of Pulse Canada talking about some of the transportation topics that were in the federal budget last week. Last week on the RealAg Radio podcast, Tyler McCann from CAPI brought up a very, very good point as we analyzed not only the transportation components of the budget, but also, the overall picture. And he made a point that a lot of the attention gets put on the items that are the big numbers, like $330 million over 10 years to research dairy solids, okay, as an example, or $25 million for this, $100 million for that, $150 for this. Those are important pieces, but sometimes you got to get to like page 6. You got to get to the deeper items, the items that sometimes don't have a number attached to them, that provides some policy guidance as well. And the transportation file was an example of that. Really appreciate Greg Northey going through some of this with us. He follows these transportation issues maybe better than anybody else. So great. And from a Western Canadian perspective, if you're farming in Saskatchewan, transportation is critical to your farm success. You can, if Mother Nature cooperates and you grow the crop, you harvest the crop, it's sitting in the bin, you market the crop. But if we have transportation logistical issues to get that crop from your farm to the terminal, to the coast, out to sea, if that isn't a reality and doesn't happen in the best ways, most efficient ways possible, you're disadvantaged at the farm gate. And we know this all too well during some of the container crisis that we saw during the pandemic. It's just an example when it comes to pulses. So this is very, very... One thing I forgot to ask Greg about was a lot of attention through the winter months about the fact that we still in Vancouver can't load ships in the rain. And was there any money dedicated to that? I think that was omitted from the budget, which is a bit of a peculiar omission based on the amount of attention that it has gotten here through the winter months. Well, we got to take a quick break. We'll be back with more of RealAg on the weekend right after this.
Want to get the best out of your soybean crops? Whether you've been growing them for a generation or are just starting into soybeans, find what you need to know at soybeanschool.com. You'll see videos on growing tips, pest control, and much more from specialists across the region, all in one place. Easy for you to access from your desktop, tablet, or mobile phone. Maximize your yields by staying up to date with the Soybean School, presented by BASF, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta Canada.
Before you get back in the field this year, spend some time with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com. Get all the information you need on hybrid selection, planting depth, crop inputs, and more from a wide range of industry experts. A massive library of video content is available on demand when you need it most. Spend your time outside of the field, inside the classroom, with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com.
Welcome back to RealAg on the weekend. RealAgriculture.com's editor Lyndsey Smith had an opportunity to talk to the chair in pulse crop breeding and genetics at the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Tom Warketin, and they talked about the future of pulse breeding and what are some of the priorities that CDC is working on to benefit growers not only in Saskatchewan but across Western Canada and the Northern Plains.
In looking at the objectives for your breeding program, has that shifted in the last, let's say, 5 years? Or how often do you have to sort of realign things based on end goals?
Overall plant breeding objectives don't change very rapidly because plant breeding is a long-term activity. And we have some broad goals that are the same as we've had for 20 years. For example, we definitely want higher yielding varieties. So that stays at the forefront of our objectives. We want varieties that have good lodging resistance, so they're easier to harvest. We want better disease resistance in a broad way, and we want good end-use quality for various markets. So those broad components are the same from, for a long period of time. But some of the individual nuances of those do change a bit. So, for example, on disease resistance, if you go back a decade or more, we talked a lot about the Ascochyta complex, the above ground foliage disease that's really important in pea around the world, really. So we put a lot of effort on that. And it was not an easy problem, and by no means have we solved it. But I think we've gradually accumulated through breeding and pathology work some some minor resistances that make the varieties a bit more durable, you could say, to the Ascochyta complex. I think we have not had as many major like severe outbreaks or severe losses from Ascochyta in recent times. But in the last decade now, we've been putting much more emphasis on the below ground diseases, the root rots. And so our emphasis has gone a little higher on those. Not that we've forgotten about Ascochyta, but just an emphasis shift. And then maybe on the aspects of seed quality, if you go back 10, 20 years, we emphasized the visual quality of the seeds. Are they smooth, round? Do they have nice color? And all those things are still important. But over time, we've emphasized more in recent years about protein, for example, having higher protein in peas, really in response to the fractionation industry that has been building in the last decade or so.
So my question on both of those, because in my mind, it makes sense. Sort of the one certainly has been maybe environmentally driven as to what farmers are facing in their fields, and the other, of course, fine-tuning what an end user is looking for and what the market is demanding. So, but how do you, as you mentioned, especially on the disease front, it's not like Ascochyta has gone away. So how do you, and as you said, it's not solved. How do you, that sounds complicated then to be trying to, breed for a very present and expanding problem, but also keeping in mind there's still this long-standing issue of Ascochyta. So how do you sort of balance the two?
Yeah, no, it's good, and it's difficult, obviously, and probably in plant breeding we try to tackle everything, and that's a massive challenge. So for example, we still will rate our plots for Ascochyta, so we haven't forgotten about it. We select those that are better. When we can. There are times when we don't see much difference amongst a whole block of breeding material, that they're all similar, or they all have reasonable resistance, and there's not much to choose between them. So, okay, that's fine. Then we'll put our emphasis on other traits in that particular trial or that season. But the work on the root rots has been more prevalent, more in the news, more in the demand from growers, and so we've had some specific research projects that we're conducting in collaboration with our plant pathology colleagues, Dr. Benitza here, Dr. Chatterton in Lethbridge in Ag Canada. So we just put some extra work on those, and we've been basically conducting a kind of molecular breeding together with phenotyping in different ways to move along the work on root rots.
So, and we'll be following up and doing a whole episode on Aphanomyces and root rot complexes. But what progress on the genetic side have you made in recent years? Has it been promising, or is it a struggle?
I would say it's promising. We will have a few lines in the co-op test this year for which we think we have improved resistance. The proof will be in the pudding, as they say, and that material will be tested very intensely at 10 or so sites in the co-op test, as well as in disease nurseries over the next 2 years. So a year from now, or even 6 months from now, I'll be able to give you a more definitive answer. But we think we have made good progress by using molecular tools to bring in at least some partial resistance to the disease from original sources of resistance. So I'm optimistic. And those are in a good background, an adapted background, meaning a high-yielding background.
Right, because this is always the other part, right? Is if you find a trait you want, if it's not in the background you desire, then there's the whole other work of putting it where you want it. So that sounds positive to me.
Yeah, good. I think so. I think it is positive.
Well, that's good. Now, so shifting gears a little bit then in looking at then the protein component, the protein side of field pea, certainly peas have been a staple, especially for Saskatchewan. We're seeing peas being grown in perhaps an expanded area where they used to be, maybe into Manitoba, because of some processing that's come along as well. How much demand is there, or how much input, I guess, is there on, is it strictly protein level that end users are looking for, or is it specific protein components that are being sought after right now?
For now, it's mainly the concentration of protein. More is better. And so that's our number one focus. But secondly, we are also looking at the protein quality in terms of the amino acid profile. But I think from the industry, and it's not one homogeneous industry, there are various companies involved. But in general, what I hear is looking for more protein concentration. There hasn't been as much of a pull for certain qualities. But as researchers, we try to look 5 and 10 years ahead, and we think that there's a possibility that certain better qualities of the protein will be desired in the future.
That was Lyndsey Smith of RealAgriculture talking to Dr. Tom Warketin of the CDC. And of course, when it comes to pulse breeding, there's going to be some big-time changes in Saskatchewan. CDC will not be the only breeding program in the game. Of course, Lima Grain also signing an agreement with the Saskatchewan pulse growers to develop pulses. Thanks so much for joining us for RealAg on the weekend here on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM. Have a great Easter weekend, everybody.